The Daily Life of the Aztecs, on the Eve of the Spanish Conquest. Chapter 4. A Mexican's Day. The House, Furniture, and Gardens. Different kinds of house. Mats, chests, seats, various pieces of furniture. Heating and lighting. The hearth, center of the house. The splendor of the gardens. Getting up, washing and dressing, clothes. Personal cleanliness and baths. Hairdressing. Women's beauty and its care. Men's and women's clothes. Sandals, luxury in clothes and ornaments, business, work, ceremonies, farming work, state business and public service, the priests, lawsuits, holidays and rites, various trades, meals, the time of meals, Mexican cooking and its natural resources, banquets, tobacco and narcotics, alcohol and drunkenness, games and amusements, hunting, the ball game, gambling, the rhythm of day and night, measurement of time in a clockless civilization, intervals marked by priestly instruments, nocturnal activity. The house, furniture, and gardens. The sky above the volcanoes grows pale. The morning star shines with the brilliance of a gem, and to greet it, the wooden gongs beat on the temple tops, and the conches wail. There are still wafts of mist over the water, in the icy air of this altitude, but they dissolve in the first rays of the sun. Day has begun. People are waking up in all the houses, great and small, from one end of the city to the other, and in the lakeside villages and solitary huts. With their wicker fans, the women blow on the fire that smolders between the hearthstones, and then, kneeling before the metlat of the volcanic stone, they begin grinding the maize. The work of the day begins with this dull rumble of the grinder. It has begun like this for thousands of years. A little later comes the rhythmic slapping of the women, gently flattening the maize dough between their hands to make the pancake like tortillas or tlaxcali. In the gardens and courtyards, there are the gobbling turkeys, busily picking about. Naked or sandaled feet pad along the earth roads. Paddles stir the water of the canals. Everyone hurries towards the day's work. Very soon the men are all gone, to the city or into the fields, often carrying their itacat, luncheon, in a bag, and the women stay at home. In a town like Mexico, there were naturally great differences between the various kinds of house, according to the rank, the wealth, or the profession of the people who lived in them. At the one extreme stood the palaces of the emperor and the dignitaries, huge constructions with both a public and private character and with many rooms, and at the other with the peasants' huts in the suburbs, made of mud and wattle, with grass roofs. Most of the houses were made of sun-dried brick. The more modest constructions had only one main room. The kitchen would be a little separate building in the courtyard. The number of rooms increased with a family's wealth. An average type of house had a kitchen, a room where the whole family slept, and a little domestic shrine. The bathroom, temazcali, was always built separately. If it was possible, the number of rooms was increased, and there was a tendency to reserve one or more for the women. Craftsmen had their workshops and traders their warehouses. The site upon which each house was built was rarely completely covered by the buildings. There was an inner courtyard, a garden where the children could play in the perpetually spring-like water of Tenochtitlan, and the women could weave and spin. Most of these plots were bordered on at least one side by a canal, and each family had its own landing place. It was thus that the merchants could come by night to store their goods without being seen. The houses, grand or simple, hardly differed at all in their furnishing. This was reduced, as it is in the East, to a point that would mean discomfort to us. The beds were no more than mats, many or few, finer or coarser. A sort of bed curtain might be set up over them. As in the case of the beds, these Spaniards were given in Ashayacat's place. However a great lord he might be, no one had any other bed other than this kind, says Bernal Diaz. And this was in a royal palace. Among the common people, a single mat answered the purpose, and during the daytime it was a seat. In fact, it was a mat, betlat, set upon a low platform made of earth or, for more solemn occasions, of wood. That was the seat, not only in private houses, but everywhere. In law courts, for example. The word betlat was even used to mean a court or an office of the administration. A more highly evolved chair existed, however, the ikbali made of wood or wickerwork, and with a back, and in the manuscripts, emperors and dignitaries are often shown sitting on them. They were low chairs without feet. The cushion upon which one sat cross-legged rested directly on the ground. The back, which leaned backwards a little, came somewhat higher than the sitter's head. These ikbali were made particularly at Cuautitlan, which had to supply 4,000 a year and as many mats by way of tax. The furniture meant for the emperor was covered with cloth or skins and adorned with gold. A family's clothes, pieces of cloth, and jewels were kept in wickerwork chests called betlakali, a word which also means the state treasure and is found in the name of the official, the betlakakalt, in charge of the finances of the empire. These frail coffers, which were only covered baskets, offered no real resistance to thieves, nor did the lockless doors, and from this rose the extreme severity of the laws against theft. When it was desired to protect things very thoroughly, they were closed in behind a false wall in the house. Motekusoma did this to hide the treasure of Ashayakat, mats, chests, and a few seats, and all these woven out of reeds or brushes. That was the furniture of an Aztec house, rich or poor. In the emperor's palace, and no doubt among the dignitaries, there were also a few low tables and richly ornamented wooden screens, which served to keep off the excessive heat of the fire or to cut off a part of the room for a time. If it was cold, says Diaz, they made for Motekusoma a great fire of embers with bark that made no smoke and that smelt very pleasant, and so that these embers should not give more heat than he wanted. They put before the fire a kind of plank adorned with gold and having representations of idols upon it. And when he began to eat, a wooden door, all decorated with gold, was put in front of him so that he should not be seen eating. In passing, one may observe the worthy Diaz's difficulty at this point, for he had obviously never seen a screen at home in Spain. It is also clear from this description that even among the great men there was no dining room. Meals were eaten anywhere at all. Thus furnished, or rather thus devoid of furniture, these houses must have appeared naked and cold, with their floors of beaten earth or flags and their whitewashed walls. It is probable, however, that the walls of the richer houses were decorated with frescoes or were hung with colored cloth or skins. When guests were invited, the inside of the house was ornamented with flowers and branches. For heating, there were wood fires. The importance of wood as a fuel is emphasized by the frequent mention of it in literature, or braziers. They were not really very efficient methods of heating, and although the Mexican climate does not run to extremes of cold, the Aztecs must have shivered on their mounts on those winter nights when the temperature fell suddenly. Yet the Aztecs were much happier than the Romans, whose system of heating was not much better, for at least they were sure of being able to get warm again in the sun when the day was come, for the winter is a dry season in Mexico. As for the lighting, it was no less primitive. Resinous torches of pine wood, ocot, were used indoors, and outside links and huge braziers piled with resinous wood served for public lighting when circumstances, a religious ceremony for example, called for it. In the middle of every house, particularly the most unassuming, there was the hearth, the image and the incarnation of the old god, the god of fire. The three stones between which the logs were burnt, or upon which the pots rested, had therefore a sacred character. The mysterious power of the god was within them, and anyone who offended the fire by walking on the hearthstones was sure to die very soon. Fire was held in particular veneration by the merchants. During the night before the departure of a caravan, they would gather at the house of one of their number, and standing before his hearth, they would sacrifice birds, burn incense, and throw magic figures cut out of paper into the flames. On their return, they gave the fire its share of the feast, with which they celebrated the fortunate outcome of their voyage. The luxury of the great houses did not reside in their furnishing, whose simplicity has been described, nor in their comfort, which was hardly better than that of the simplest dwellings, but in the size and number of their rooms, and perhaps even more in the variety and splendor of their gardens. The palace of King Nasahuacoyota Texcoco was a rectangle more than 1,000 yards long by some 800 wide. Part of the space was occupied by public buildings, council chambers, courts, offices, armories, and part by private, the king's apartments, the harem, the apartments intended for the sovereigns of Mexico and Tlacopan. In all, they amounted to more than 300 rooms. The rest was given over to the gardens, with many fountains, ponds, and canals, many fish and birds, and the whole planted with more than 2,000 pines. And there were several mazes, according to where the king bathed, and once a man was in, he could not find the way out. And farther on, beside the temples, there was the birdhouse, where the king kept all the kinds and varieties of birds, animals, reptiles, and serpents that they brought him from every part of New Spain. and those which were not to be had were represented in gold and precious stones, which was also the case with the fish, both those of the sea and those that lived in the rivers and lakes. So no bird, fish, or animal of the whole country was wanting here. They were either alive or figured in gold and gems. Besides his palace at Texcoco, the same king had had gardens planted in other places, particularly at Tezcotzinco. These parks and gardens were adorned with rich and sumptuously ornamented alcazars with their fountains, their irrigation channels, their canals, their lakes, and their bathing places, and wonderful mazes, where he had had a great variety of flowers planted and trees of all kinds, foreign and brought from distant parts, and the water intended for the fountains, pools, and channels for watering the flowers and the trees in the park came from its spring. To bring it, it had been necessary to build strong, high cemented walls of unbelievable size, going from one mountain to the other with an aqueduct on top, which came out at the highest part of the park. The water accumulated first in a reservoir beautified with historical bas-reliefs, which had the first bishop of Mexico, Brother Juan de Zumarraga, had broken, because he believed that they had to do with idolatry. And thence it flowed off by two principal canals, the one to the north, the other to the south, running through the gardens and filling basins, where sculptured stelae were reflected in the surface. Coming out of one of these basins, the water leapt and dashed itself to pieces on the rocks, falling into a garden planted with all the scented flowers of the hotlands. And in this garden it seemed to rain, so very violently was the water shattered upon these rocks. Beyond this garden there were the bathing places, cut in the living rock, and beyond them the castle that the king had in this park, and in which still other rooms and halls were seen, and many of them. One was a very large hall with a court in front of it, and it was there that he received the kings of Mexico and Tlacopan and other great lords when they came to enjoy themselves with him. The dances and the other spectacles and delights took place in this court. The whole of the rest of this park was planted, as I have said, with all kinds of trees and scented flowers, and there were all kinds of birds apart from those that the king had brought from various parts in cages. All these birds sang harmoniously and to such degree that one could not hear oneself speak. Outside the gardens and beyond a wall the country began, full of deer, rabbits, and hares. As the Hispanified Indian chronicler Ixtlilxochitl, himself descended from the Nezahualcóyotl, let himself be carried away by pride in the dynasty, the remaining traces of the gardens of Tezcotzinco, alas, give but a faint idea of their former splendor, but they confirm Ixtlilxochitl in the essentials. The cascades, the sheets of water, and the flower beds have vanished, but the empty reservoirs are still to be seen cut into the rock. The aqueduct, the steps, and the terraces are still there. Besides, the conquerors saw comparable marvels from the time they first came into the Valley of Mexico. They passed the night before their entry into the capital at Iztapalapa. Diaz was entranced by the palace in which they stayed, so large and well built in the best kind of stone, with the roof timbers made of cedar and other sweet-smelling woods, very big rooms, and what was particularly worth seeing, patios covered over with cotton awnings. When we had looked through all this, we went into the garden. It was delightful to walk in it, and I was never weary of observing the variety of plants and their perfumes, the flower beds, many fruit trees and roses of the country, and a pool of sweet water. There was another extraordinary thing. Large boats could come right into this orchard from the lake, and the old Spanish ruler, writing his memoirs many years later, adds sadly, "Ahora todo está por el suelo, perdido que no hay cosa." And now all that is fallen, lost, nothing is left any more. And this was only at Tecutli's palace. What then must have been the emperor's country seats and pleasure houses? Cortes wrote to Charles V, he, Moctezuma, had many pleasure houses, both in the city and outside it. In one of them there is a magnificent garden, and in it there rose belvederes made of marble, floored with exquisitely worked jasper. There were 10 lakes there, where there were kept all the many and varied kinds of water birds that lived in that country. There were saltwater lakes for the birds of the seashore and fresh water for those of the rivers. From time to time these lakes were emptied for cleaning, and then they were refilled by means of the canals. Each kind of bird had the sort of food that was appropriate for in its natural state. Thus those which ate fish were given fish, those which ate worms were given worms, those which ate maize were given maize. And I assure your Majesty that the fish-eating birds alone were given 10 arrobas a day, about 264 pounds. 300 men took care of these birds and did nothing else. Others were solely occupied with looking after sick birds. There were corridors and places for watching above each of the lakes, where Moctezuma would stand to amuse himself by looking at them. And this was not all, for the conquistador goes on. The Mexican emperor also kept freaks, and particularly albinos, white from birth in face, body, hair, eyelashes, and eyelids. Also dwarves, hunchbacks, and other malformed people. Birds of prey in cages which were partly roofed to keep them from the rain and partly open for the sun and air. Pumas, jaguars, coyotes, foxes, and wild cats. Hundreds of attendants looked after each of the kinds of men or animals that made up this garden museum. If the testimony of Cortez were insufficient, it is corroborated by that of his fellow adventurers. Andres de Tapia uses almost the same words in listing the many kinds of birds, wild beasts, and freaks that Moctezuma kept for his amusement. In very big jars and pots in this house, he adds, there were quite large numbers of snakes and vipers, and all this purely with a view to magnificence. Bernaldius confirms this detail, speaking of many snakes and venomous serpents which have a kind of sounding rattle on their tails. They are the most dangerous vipers of all. They are kept in jars and large pots, with a great many feathers, and it is there that they lay their eggs and bring up their little serpents. And when the tigers and the lions roared, and the wolves and the foxes howled, and the serpents hissed, it was dreadful to hear, and one would have thought oneself in hell. However, we will not linger over our chronicler's reactions, for they are, after all, only those of a provincial who finds himself for the first time in his life in a zoological garden, that typical element of a civilized town. The undoubted fact is the care with which the rulers of ancient Mexico gathered around them all the animals and plants of their country. The Aztecs had a positive passion for flowers. The whole of their lyric poetry is a hymn to flowers, which intoxicate by their loveliness and their scent. The first Moctezuma, when he had conquered Oaxtepec in the hotlands of the west, decided to make a garden there where all the tropical species should be cultivated. Imperial messengers traversed the provinces in search of flowering shrubs, which were dug up with care to preserve their roots unbroken and wrapped in mats. 40 Indian families, which came from the parts where these plants were found, were installed at Oaxtepec, and the emperor himself solemnly opened the gardens. All the Mexicans, though naturally on a more modest scale, shared this love of gardens. The citizens of Mexico grew flowers in their courtyards and on their roofs, and in the lakeside suburb Xochimilco. The place of the fields of flowers was then, as it is now, the garden which supplied the whole valley. Each family also had its household animals. The turkey, that farmyard bird which Mexico has given to the world. Some tame rabbits, dogs, some at least being for eating and fattened for that purpose. Sometimes bees, and very often parrots or macaws. Life was led much more out of the doors than in, under the most sunlit sky in the world. And the city, still near to its original earth, mixed innumerable splashes of green and the delicate mosaic of flowers with the dazzling whiteness of the temples. Getting up, washing, dressing, clothes. The Mexican slept on a mat, without a nightshirt, and indeed almost naked except for his loincloth, with his cloak or his blankets, if he had any, over him. At daybreak, he had only to put on his sandals and tie his cloak on his shoulders, and he was ready to go to his work. At least, this was the case with the plebeians. The dignity of the officials called for more considerable preparation. Everybody got up very early. The law courts, for example, opened at dawn, and the judges took their seats in the earliest half-light. But for all that, a love of cleanliness seems to have been general throughout a population. No doubt the members of the ruling class gave up more of their time and attention to it than ordinary citizens. Moctezuma washed his body twice a day, says Andres de Tapia, not without astonishment. But everybody bathed often, and many of them every day, in the rivers, lakes, or pools. The young men were accustomed to this by their education. They were often obliged to get up at night to bathe in the cold water of the lake or in a spring. The Aztecs did not make soap, but there were two vegetable products which served instead: the fruits of the copachocot, called the soap tree by the Spaniards, and the root of the Hipanic Americana. Either of them would give a lather which could be used not only for washing but also for the laundry. The fact that habits of cleanliness were very thoroughly established is proved by the exceptions. In some cases, hair went unsoaped and the body unwashed. Merchants, for example, when they left for a long and dangerous expedition, would vow not to bathe until their return, which for them was a very real sacrifice. During the month Atemosli, as a penance, people did not use soap. Bathing was not only an act of cleanliness, it was also very often a ritual ablution. The prisoners who were to be sacrificed to Huitzilopochtli during the festivals of the month Banquets underwent a ritual bath. The old men of the Kapuli procured the water at Huitzilopochtli in a cave, and the victims were called La'autiltin, those who had been bathed. The baths that the priests took in the waters of the lake during the month Quetzalcoatlitl also had an obviously ceremonial character. To some degree, the same applied to the typically Mexican steam bath, the temazcali. This very characteristic practice, which still goes on in the Nahuatl villages, was so general in the days before the Spaniards that the greater part of the houses had close by them a little hemispherical building made of stones and cement, which was used for having a steam bath. The fireplace was built outside the temazcali itself, and it had a common wall with it, made of porous stone. This wall was brought to a glowing heat by a fire of wood. When it was ready, the Indian who intended to bathe crept into the temazcali by a little low door and threw the water on the red-hot wall. He was then enveloped in steam, and he switched himself violently with grasses. Often there would be another person there, particularly if the bather were an invalid, to massage him. And after the massage, the bather would lie on a mat to let the bath have its effect. Clearly, the bath was expected to have two effects. On the one hand, it was thought of as an act of cleanliness and as a form of medical treatment, and on the other as an act of purification. Women who had babies went to the temazcali before taking up ordinary life again, a practice that still prevails. The Codex of 1576 records that in the year Acat, or 1363, the wives of the Mexicans had their children at Zoquipan and bathed themselves at Temazcatlitan, the place of the steam baths. Nature, in giving the Indians a sparse and meager beard, had spared them the problems and wretchedness that afflicted the Greeks and the Romans, and which afflict the Europeans now. They did not shave. In their old age, their chins were adorned by a beard rather like those which one sees on Chinese sages in the painting and sculpture of the Far East. And in this case, too, it was a mark of wisdom. Hair was generally worn short, cut short across the forehead and long elsewhere. But certain ranks and professions had their own kind of haircut. The priests shaved the front and the sides of their head, but let the hair on their top alone, while the young warriors wore a long lock which they cut off when they had accomplished their first feat of arms. Female beauty looked after itself in Mexico with resources not unlike those which are to be found in the Old World. Looking glasses made of obsidian or pyrites, carefully polished ointments, creams, and scent. The women, who were naturally brown, try to give their skins a light yellow tint. They are often depicted in manuscripts with this color in contrast to the men. They succeeded by using an ointment called ashin, or a yellow earth, tecosautli, which was so much in request that some provinces supplied it as a tribute. The custom of staining one's teeth black or red was the general among the Huastecs and the Otomi, and some Mexican women had taken to it. As for their hair, the prevailing fashion at the time of the conquest required that it should be raised on the head so as to form two loops above the forehead, like little horns. This is particularly to be seen in the Codex Azcatitlan. Women's fashions in Mexico tended to react against the barbarous delight in ornamentation which was general among the neighboring peoples. The Otomi women, not content with making themselves up and staining their teeth, went so far as to cover their bosoms and arms with tattooing, in a very delicate blue pattern, dyed into the very flesh with little knives. At Tenochtitlan, a woman of the ruling class was supposed to rely upon cleanliness alone to enhance her charms. In the morning, wash your face, wash your hands, clean your mouth, said a father to his daughter. Listen to me, child. Never make up your face nor paint it. Never put red on your mouth to look beautiful. Makeup and paint are things that light women use, shameless creatures. If you want your husband to love you, dress well, wash yourself, and wash your clothes. It was the amusements, the courtesans who accompanied the young warriors, who used these aids to beauty. The courtesan grooms herself and dresses with such care that when she is thoroughly ready she looks like a flower. And to make herself ready, she first looks into her glass, she bathes, washes, and freshens herself in order to please. She makes up her face with a yellow cream called ashin, which gives her a dazzling complexion, and sometimes, being a lost woman, she puts on rouge. She also has the habit of dyeing her teeth red with cochineal and of wearing her hair loose for more beauty. She perfumes herself with an odoriferous censer, and in walking about she chews sickly, making a clacking noise with her teeth like castanets. The man's chief garment, which was kept on at night, was the loincloth, mastlat, which went round his waist and between his legs to be tied in front. The two ends, often fringed and embroidered, fell before and behind. The loincloth, whether in its simplest form of a plain length of material or in the utmost elaboration of ornament, is to be found among the Olmecs and the Mayas in the highest antiquity. In the 16th century, all the civilized nations of Mexico wore it, except the Tarascas in the west and the Aztecs in the northeast, a fact that somewhat scandalized the Mexicans of the center. A man of the people wore nothing else when he was working on the land or carrying burdens. But the use of the cloak, the domatli, had become quite general. It was made of agave fiber for ordinary people and of cotton for others, or sometimes of rabbit hair that might be threaded through or reinforced with feathers for the winter. It was a simple rectangular piece of cloth, and it was tied over the right shoulder or the chest. Buttons, hooks, and brooches were unknown to the Aztecs. A man, on sitting down, would slide the cloak round so as to bring it all forward and cover his body and legs. An Indian crowd in the Mexican streets must have looked quite like a crowd of Athenians with their cloaks. The Indians wore them in the same way as our forefathers in classical antiquity. But the piece of cloth that they covered themselves with, which was white and unornamented among the ordinary people, could show an extraordinary wealth of color and pattern among the dignitaries. The weaving women's art, for it was women who made these splendid clothes, seemed to have come from the east, from the hot lands where the cotton grew, and where the material seemed to copy the iridescent plumage of the tropical birds. In Aztec times, it was still admitted that the most beautiful materials and the most brilliantly colored embroideries came from the Totonac and Huastec countries. The tribute brought thousands of loads of splendid cloaks, loincloths, and skirts woven in the eastern provinces, Toxpan, Cuauhtoxco, Cuautlaxtlan, and Toxtepec, to Mexico. The weaving women of the capital itself were held to be particularly favored by Xochiquetzal, the goddess of flowers, youth, and love. And it was said that women born under the sign of Se Xochitl, one flower, would be both skillful weavers and generous with their favors. The Codex Magliabechiano reproduces many styles of tilmatli decorated with patterns in which there is a most charming combination of imagination, dignity, and measure. The most usual themes are suns, stylized shells, jewels, fish, abstract geometrical shapes, cacti, feathers, skins of tigers and snakes, rabbits, and butterflies. There are others to be found in the various manuscripts. Sahagun lists and describes certain varieties. For example, that which was called Coashayakayo Tilmatli, literally cloak with snakes' faces. The whole cloak was tawny and it had the face of a monster or a demon on a red background in a silver circle. It was entirely decorated with these circles and these faces, and all round it there was a fringe. Another cloak was woven with designs that represented seashells, which were made of rabbit hair dyed red on a background of pale blue whirlpools. These designs were framed in blue, one half light blue, the other dark, and they also had a border of white feathers. The fringe was made of rabbit hair, and its color was red. Still others had a tawny background, and scattered upon it butterflies woven from white feathers. One can imagine the fantastic effect that these brilliantly colored clothes must have had under the blazing Mexican sun, when the crowd of nobles and warriors thronged round the emperor. The priest Tilmatli was black or very dark green, and it was often embroidered with skulls and human bones. The emperors, and he alone had the right to wear this equivalent of the Roman purple, was colored with the blue-green of the turquoise, and indeed it was called Shiltimatli, the turquoise cloak. Maslat and Tilmatli, loincloth and cloak. These were the essentials of the masculine costume. There are a very great many pictures in the manuscripts, quite apart from the details supplied by a study of the sculpture, and among these, although they are post-Cortesian, may be cited those which are to be found in the Bibliothèque Nationale at Paris, and which are attributed to Ishli-Sochli. They represent Indian nobles, and there is in particular a very charming portrait of the young Nasahuapili, king of Texcoco, wearing a loincloth and a magnificent cloak, both of them woven with geometrical patterns and carrying a bunch of flowers in his left hand, while his right has a feather fan or fly whisk. Although they are basically so simple, one cannot help admiring the grace, the dignity, and the splendor of these clothes. Nevertheless, it is clear from the text and the iconography of the subject that there were also other garments in general use. A kind of triangular apron could prolong the loincloth from hip to upper thigh. This is to be seen as early as the warrior caryatids in the ancient Toltec city of Tula, as well as in the figure of the Emperor Tizoc in the bas-reliefs of the monument that commemorates him. Sometimes the priests and the warriors wore, under their cloaks or instead of them, a very short-sleeved tunic, the shikoli, which opened in the front and which could be closed by tying a ribbon. Another version of the chikoli had no opening, but had to be pulled over one's head like a shirt, or like the blouse, huipili, that the women wore. This tunic could either cover the trunk only, like a waistcoat or a short jacket, or it could fall over the loincloth as far as the knees. Then there are two other facts that should be pointed out. The first is that those who would put on 2 or 3 cloaks, one on top of the other. The second, that although ordinarily the Mexican wore loose clothes, in time of war, on the other hand, he had close-fitting garments. The uniforms of the Tiger Knights, for example, entirely conformed to the shape of their bodies, as do the mechanics' or airmen's overalls. The blouse finished in a helmet that covered the head, and the trousers went down as far as the ankles. The traditional armor of the Aztec warrior, the Ichkahuipili, or cotton blouse, was a close-fitting garment so stuffed or wadded that it could turn and narrow. Thus the ancient Mexicans had at the same time both the loose and fitting, the two great divisions that the costume of the world falls into, and of which each nation usually chooses only one. The basis of the Mexican women's costume, as the mashla was the basis of the man's, was the queit, or skirt rather, made of a length of cloth wrapped around the lower part of the body, tied at the waist by an embroidered belt, and falling almost to the ankles. Among the lower classes and in the country, the women often let their bosoms uncovered, but in the town and among the women of the middle class, or the better sort, a kind of blouse called a huipili was worn outside the skirt. It was embroidered at the neck. Everyday clothes were plain and white, but ceremonial or holiday clothes displayed a great variety of colors and patterns. All witnesses emphasized the brilliance and the splendor of the blouses and the skirts worn by the women of noble families and those who took part in the ritual dances. In the dances of the month Hue Tequihuit, the women, especially the Ahuanime, danced with the soldiers, and they were all well dressed, and they wore ornaments and beautiful skirts and blouses. Some of their skirts were decorated with hearts, others with a braided pattern like the bosoms of birds, others with the patterns of blankets, or with spirals or leaves, and others again were of plain cloth. They were bordered and fringed. They all had embroidered hems. As for their blouses, some had flowing brown designs, others patterns representing smoke, others black ribbons. Others were decorated with houses, others with fishes. The colors were all broad, and the embroidered edges were also wide and full. King Huitzilopochtli's two favorites are shown dressed in white blouses embroidered at the neck and waist, and in white skirts with broad embroidered hems. In this case, too, it was from the East that the art of embroidering in many colors and the taste for the embroidery in splendid materials came to influence the dwellers on the high plateau. The Eastern goddesses, such as Tlazolteotl, always appear in the pages of the figured manuscripts with a cotton scarf wound round their heads, with spindles stuck in it. The women of the Aztecs and the Totonacs of the slopes of the Sierra Madre, and the old nations like the Otomi, which had long been in contact with their eastern neighbors, were particularly eager for style and brilliance. There, the Aztec clothes are elegant and distinguished, for it is in their country that are made the cloaks called Sensontilmatli or Sensonquashli, which means cloaks of 1,000 colors. The cloaks decorated with monsters' heads are painted, and those which have whirlpools are brought from those parts. And the Aztec weavers surpass themselves in the making of these materials, and many others like them. The women take great care of their appearance. They are very well dressed, and they go about looking very fine. As for the Totonacs, their women gaze at themselves in their looking glasses. They wear skirts and blouses with woven patterns, and they know very well how to dress themselves. So their skirts were called Intlalapalque, many-colored skirts. The noble women were magnificently dressed in these, the ordinary women in skirts of blue. All of them threaded feathers into their hair, dyed different colors. They walked about gracefully adorned with flowers. It was the same with the people who lived on the shores of the Gulf. The women are excellent weavers, very expert at working in cloth, and this is quite natural, since they belong to such a good, rich country. As for the Otomi women, they were perfectly happy to take any fashions that pleased them from the neighboring tribes, and whatever they saw in the line of clothes, that they put on. It was no doubt, though, then, that the habit of wearing that typically Eastern garment, the Geshkamit, was introduced into central Mexico. This was a graceful lozenge-shaped pelerine or mantle, richly decorated and embroidered. In the pre-Cortesian era, many of the colored Geshkamit belonged particularly to the women of the Totonacs, but Aztec sculpture shows certain goddesses with their bosoms covered by this fringed cloak. At the present time, the Indian women belonging to the various tribes of the eastern slopes or the high plateau, Totonacs, Nawa, Otomi, still weave this traditional garment for themselves. No doubt fashion at the Tenochtitlan accentuated simplicity in contrast to the showy medley sought after by the provincials. But even so, a procession of women going to a temple must have been a remarkably colorful sight and remarkably varied, for although the cut of the blouses and the skirts may have been the same, still the multicolored stuffs, the infinite diversity of pattern, and the brilliance of the jewels and feathers made the brown-faced, brown-armed women look like the marvelous birds of the tropics. This tendency towards luxury in clothes, although it was restrained by a regard for a certain traditional austerity, increased with increasing technical development, particularly with that of cloth-making. The nomadic people of the north, and no doubt the Aztecs themselves, to begin with, dressed in skins. The long-established settled people of the high plateau wore the fiber of the agave isle. At the date of which we are speaking, the plebeians' loincloth and the matli were still made of this cloth, which was considered suitable for the common people. Besides, the spinners had attained such skill that they could draw an extremely fine thread from the agave fiber, and it was possible to weave very supple cloth, as some Indians still do today. Some other vegetable fibers, such as those which were used for making paper, were also used for cloth. But cotton, a native of the hotlands of the east and of the west, soon became very much sought after by the Aztecs, and was considered the essential textile staple. Inishkat in Tatesh Moneki, the indispensable content. When at the end of the 14th century, the king Huitzilopochtli wished to marry a daughter of the lord of Cuernavaca, which has a semi-tropical climate. His prime motive seems to have been to provide his city with cotton. King Huitzilopochtli asked for the hand of a princess of Cuernavaca named Mihuashitwit, daughter of this same Osomatzin who ruled over Cuernavaca. And the old men said that the Lord Osomatzin had all the peasants of Cuernavaca at his command, and that they brought him the indispensable cotton and all the fruits that grow in these parts. And all of these things, nothing came to Mexico. This cotton did not reach the Mexicans, and for this reason they were very wretched. The traders and then the warriors who came into the rich tropical lands from the plateau were chiefly in search of cotton. Trade and tribute brought immense quantities of it to Mexico, either as the raw fiber or as a manufactured cloth. The men and women of Mexico, particularly those of the working class, often went barefoot, but as they rose in the social scale, they might put on cactli, sandals with fiber or hide soles, which were kept on by interlacing straps and which had a heel piece. In the more elaborate kinds, other straps were wrapped crosswise up the wearer's shins as far as his knees, forming a grave or gosewat. This was the typical footwear of the warriors. Motecuzoma sandals were heavily ornamented with gold. It is clear from the native iconography, from the Mayan bas-reliefs, through the figured manuscripts to the sculpture of the Aztecs, that the sandal, which has survived in our time in the form of the everyday huaracha of the Mexican Indians, could assume a great many varieties of shape and decoration. The precious metals, gems, skins of wild animals such as jaguars, and the feathers of tropical birds could all enter into its composition. The clothes and footwear of the ancient Mexicans may have been relatively plain, but on the other hand, nothing can give any idea of the overflowing variety or the baroque wealth of their jewels and their headdresses. The women wore earrings, necklaces, and bracelets on their arms and ankles. The men had the same ornaments, but in addition, they pierced the septum of their nose to hold gem or metal jewels. They also made holes in the skin beneath their lower lip, so as to wear chin ornaments of crystal, shell, amber, turquoise, or gold, and they placed huge and splendid structures of feathers upon their heads or their backs. In this display of rank and luxury, everything was strictly regulated in conformity with the hierarchic order. Only the emperor might wear the turquoise nose ornament. The division between his nostrils was perforated with a great ceremony after his election, and only warriors of a certain rank had the right to wear such and such a jewel, whose kind and shape was exactly laid down. The emblems, or feather ornaments, dazzlingly colored headdresses, bronze green plumes of quetzal feathers, immense butterflies, cones made of feathers or gold, cloth or feather mosaic banners to be fixed to the shoulders of chiefs, decorated shields. All these were reserved for those who had won the right to them by their exploits, and death was the punishment for any man who should presume to attribute to himself one of these marks of honor. The Indians of Mexican and Central America have, since the remotest antiquity, as may be seen in the Mayan frescoes of Bonampak, literally worshipped feathers, the long, splendid green plumes of the quetzal, the red and yellow of the parrots. They formed one of the most important articles to be delivered up to the tax collectors under the Aztec Empire. The huge feather ornaments, together with the jewels of gold and turquoise, raised the warrior, the dignitary, and the emperor high above ordinary humanity. On the one side, and in simplicity, Mexican costume touched the classical antiquity of the white-robed Mediterraneans. On the other, the redskin world of the American native, but with a delicacy unknown to the rude inhabitants of the prairie. We have a precise idea, from bas-reliefs and manuscripts, of the magnificent ornaments that could make of a man something greater than a man, almost a divine being. hieratic and filled with splendor. When to the hollow scream of conches, the beat of gongs, and the harsh cry of trumpets, there suddenly appeared to the people, crowded on the central square of the emperor, rigid beneath the gold and turquoise diadem, amidst the brilliance of green plumes, while the armor, the emblems, and the banners of the great men formed a mosaic of 1,000 colors around him. Who would not have thought that here was the chosen of Tezcatlipoca, the ruler of the world, the father and mother of the people? In that society, with its very marked graduations, ornaments and jewels, gold and feathers, were the symbols of power and the ability to govern. Business, work, ceremonies. There we have the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan, suitably dressed, shod, brushed, and made fine, and, as we have seen, at work since dawn. Many of them were still countrymen, although they lived in the city, but unfortunately it is impossible to say what proportion they bore to the others. They either grew maize, vegetables, and flowers in their gardens on the islands, upon Chinampas, or on the lake shore, or else they went in pursuit of the wildfowl or the fish of the lake. Their tools and weapons were simple: a digging stick, broadening into a spade for the workers on the land, a net, a bow and arrows, a spear thrower, and a net game bag for the fowlers and fishermen. The head of a noble family said to his sons, "Never forget that you descend from noble forefathers. Never forget that you do not descend from gardeners or woodcutters. What are you going to be? Would you like to be traders, walking with a stick in your hand and a load on your back? Would you like to be farmers or laborers? Would you like to be gardeners or woodcutters? I will tell you what you must do. Listen to me and remember what I say. First, pay great attention to dancing, to the drum and the bells, and to singing. Then, take pains to learn an honorable craft, like that of making things with feathers, or other handicrafts, because that will give you your bread in time of need. And above all, learn about farming, for farming is nourished by earth. Your ancestors could do all those things, for although they were noble and of high descent, they always saw to it that their lands and their inheritance were cultivated. Because if you think of nothing but your descent and your nobility, how will you maintain your family? What will you live on yourself? Nobody has ever seen anybody live on nobility alone. In this down-to-earth lesson, one can also very clearly see how a nobleman of Tenochtitlan regarded the vocations and what order he put them in. First come the rites, for it is the rites that he means when he speaks of song and music. This same father makes it certain, for he says, "In doing this, you will be pleasant to our Lord God who is in all places, Tezcatlipoca, and you will put your hand into the bosom of his treasures. Then come the honorable crafts, such as those of the artist craftsmen, who worked in feathers, gold, and gemstones, and above all, agriculture." Of course, there was no question of a Mexican noble working on the land like a laborer or a gardener. The suggestion is that he should direct the exploitation of his estate. The notion of high blood, which certainly exists here, in spite of the disillusion warning, nobody has ever seen a man live on nobility alone, does not follow the same boundaries as it did in our own feudal society. For example, the noble can work with his hands, but he may not become a plain peasant, nor a trader. As we have seen, the estates that members of the ruling class controlled were many and extensive, often far and sometimes very far from Mexico. Although in theory the land belonged to the state, these people had in fact a tendency that was becoming more and more like downright ownership. They therefore devoted a considerable portion of their time to visiting their estates and seeing to their proper cultivation. They might, however, be replaced by majordomos, capisque, some of whom were trustworthy slaves who at length succeeded in growing wealthy and who often freed themselves. It must be realized that the house of a great Aztec lord, with its fields and woods, lakes and rivers, its workshops with many women spinning and weaving, and with craftsmen working for the master himself, formed a considerable economic entity which was partially self-supporting and which was a producer of food and clothing. On the other hand, there is no doubt that the unceasing wars and the increasing labor of administration prevented the high officials from giving their own affairs anything but the most general supervision. The gentleman farmer was becoming more and more an officer, a judge, a courtier, or a statesman, and the most important part of the work had passed into the hands of stewards. The business of stating the high command, Tlatocayot, took up the energies of the ruling class to an ever-increasing extent. In the first place, there was the war, from which all young men had trained themselves from their childhood, being so anxious to rise to be tekoiuake, and if so, they could be promoted to the higher ranks. Then there were the innumerable public offices, which required industry, integrity, and conscientiousness in those who filled them. For example, there were the Achkakawalting, the officers of the law who were charged with carrying out the sentences of the courts. There were the judges who sat from dawn until 2 hours before sunset, with only a break for a light meal and a short siesta, and who were liable to the death sentence if they accepted a bribe. Tax gatherers who were obliged to go on arduous and dangerous voyages, and who were also sentenced to death if they embezzled any part of the tribute. Ambassadors who were sent with an ultimatum from the emperor to distant cities, and who often escaped only with great difficulty. All these and many others, such as the teachers who saw the education of the boys in the local schools, owed their whole time and their whole energy to the service of the state. The Mexicans had a lofty conception of public service and the authority that went with it. The greatest lord was bound to obey the orders of a simple messenger bearing the commands of a court of law. But at the same time, the laws and customs were terribly severe. Woe to the drunken judge, the over-accommodating judge, woe to the dishonest civil servant. The sentence of the king of Texcoco was always quoted as an example. He, hearing that one of his judges had favored a noble against a Masewali, had the unrighteous justice hanged. If the power was very great, the duties were very heavy. The higher a man rose in rank, the less time he had for himself. The accounts of the conquerors describe Moctezuma's palace continually filled with a crowd of officials and warriors, who passed their whole day there. And one may cite those general sessions called Napuatlatoli, the 80-day speaking, which took place at the end of each period of 4 months by the native calendar, during which all outstanding political or judicial business was dealt with, the sittings lasting from dawn until night. Still more, one may cite the councils, the Tlatocan at Mexico, and the 4 great councils at Texcoco, which, to judge by the accounts that have come down to us, were a positive endurance test, with their uncountable speeches full of stylized eloquence and loaded with traditional figures. The Mexican upper class was, by definition, that part of the nation which devoted itself to public life, but public life laid very heavy burdens upon them, and took up by far the greater share of their time and energies. As for the priests, who together with the civil or military officials made up a great proportion of this upper class, their entire life was out of their personal control, since their religious duties occupied them both day and night, and since unfaithfulness to their vows brought upon them the severest kind of punishment. The 10th statute of Nezahualcóyotl punished the lecherer or drunken priest with death. It may be observed in passing that the gravity of the sentence always increased in proportion with the rank of the culprit. The punishment for a plebeian who was drunk in public was a severe admonition and the shame of having his head shaven. For a noble, it was death. It was also death for a noble who had robbed his father, whereas a Masewali guilty of the same crime got off with penal slavery. Duty, responsibility, and danger increased with power and wealth. Judges and law courts have often been referred to. It appears that law and court cases had a large place in everyday life. The Indians were of a litigious nature, and they kept the lawyers busy. In the towns and villages of the provinces there were courts of first instance who judges pronounced upon relatively unimportant cases. Above all, at Mexico and Texcoco, there were judges, natives of each region, for the cases that were set up to them from those regions. The Court of Appeal for the whole empire sat at Texcoco. It was made up of 12 judges, and it sat every 12 days under the presidency of the king of Texcoco to decide the most difficult cases. No case could last for more than 80 days, for the whole object of the whole general sessions was to wind up all unconcluded business. It was a most uncommonly expeditious system. Each trial brought into being a file kept by an official of the court who noted down in pictographic writing all the testimonies and the sentence, which was immediately put into force. It may be added that this medieval Mexico had no knowledge of judicial torture, of the question and the rack, which was only suppressed in France in the 18th century. The degree to which the members of the ruling class were taken up by their duties is surprising, but one is positively astonished when one tries to count up the time that they had to devote to worship and to ceremonies. Of course, everybody in Mexico took part in the innumerable holidays, or rather holy days, and in the complicated rites which took place on them, but here again it was the dignitaries who bore the brunt. Their presence was very often called in for the sacrifices, dancing, singing, processions, and parades, not only in the town, but more than once right around the lake. The solar year was divided into 18 months of 20 days, plus the 5 intercalary days of evil omen, during which all activity was reduced to a minimum, and a fresh set of rites and ceremonies belonged to each of these months. Some, at least, of these called for a very great effort from a very large number of people, an immense amount of organization, and a very considerable expense. It was not the priests alone who celebrated the rites, but on the contrary, some part or other of the population, according to the month. It might be the young men, the girls, the warriors, the dignitaries, certain guilds like that of the Posteca, or the goldsmiths, or often it might be the whole nation that took an active part. During the first 7 days of the month, called the Great Feast of the Lords, the emperor had the whole population served with food and drink in order to show his goodwill towards these humble people, the Massahuatzintli. Every evening at sunset, the songs and dances began, in the light of torches and braziers, and sometimes Motekusoma came out to dance. For hours on end, the warriors and the women, holding hands, came and went between the rows of braziers and torch holders. The dancing and the rhythmic chanting did not stop until well on into the night. On the 10th day, there began a series of sad and cruel ceremonies in which the central role was played by a woman dressed and adorned to represent the goddess of the young maize, Xilonen. Then, for the first time, they ate the cakes of young maize. The women and the maidens, who had never looked at any man, danced, and each person made maize cakes and offered them to the gods. The 5th month, banquets began with songs and dances, which took place each evening from sunset to midnight. 9 days before the great feast of Huitzilopochtli, the preparation of the sacrificial victims began. They were ritually bathed, and everybody, the captives and the captors, danced the dance of the serpent together during part of the night. On the 20th day, the captives went to take their leave of their masters, singing as if their voices were going to break, as if they were hoarse, and dipping their hands in ochre or blue paint, they left the marks upon the lintel or the jambs of the door. Then they began to put on the ornaments that had been got ready for them. At dawn, there began the great procession of Vaillant, the little messenger god who represented Huitzilopochtli. It went from the center of the capital to Tlatelolco, from there to the villages of the shore, Popotlan, Chapultepec, and as far as the outskirts of Coyoacan. Now and then the procession stopped and some victims were sacrificed. When Vaillant, having made this long circuit, reappeared at the Tenochtitlan and entered the sacred precinct, the conches sounded, and one by one the captives were sacrificed upon the stone before the gate of Huitzilopochtli's temple. Other customs had a character not unlike that of the popular merriment at the time of our carnival. During the first days of the month, at Temostli, the priests and the young warriors formed themselves into opposing bands and fought with twigs and reeds. If the warriors captured a priest, they rubbed him with agave leaves, which caused him to itch and to burn. And if one of the young warriors were taken, the priest scratched his ears, arms, chest, and legs with a thorn until he cried out. And if the priests managed to chase one of the young men into the palace, they pillaged it, carrying off all the mats, the carpets made of rope, the seats with backs, the beds, and the stools. If they found any gongs or drums, they took them too. They carried off everything. And if the young warriors pursued the priests into their monastery or kalmekak, they too sacked it, and carried off the mats, the conches, and the chairs. The same element of antagonism, and the same temporary permitting of acts that would at other times be severely punished, is also found in the month Titit. This time it was the little boys who were armed with bolster-like bags filled with paper or leaves, and who attacked the girls and the women. They had sticks or branches to defend themselves, but the urchins did their best to take them by surprise. They would hide their sacks and surround an unsuspecting woman, and then suddenly banging her with bags, they would all about, "Here is a bag, lady." After this, they would run away laughing. These ceremonies, whether they were terrible or beautiful, or as horrifying as the Tlaka Shipewatsi, which finished in a dance of the priests dressed in human skins, or as happy as that of Tlasochimaco, in which avalanches of flowers ran in all the temples, necessarily took up a considerable part of the time, the labor, and the resources of the community. They were both very frequent and very long, most scrupulously observed. Each detail was laid down with extraordinary care, and all the more numerous and absorbing that, in Mexico, the capital of the empire, participated in every cult and worshipped every god. For this reason, the Mexicans had the reputation, even among their near neighbors, those of Texcoco, for example, of being so religious that it was impossible to know how many gods they honored. But in order to have a clear idea of what this continual religious activity meant to them, it is necessary for us to redefine the words rite and ceremony, and to strip them of the conventional attributes that they have acquired in our civilization. For the ancient Mexicans, there was nothing more vitally important than these motions, these songs, dances, sacrifices, and traditional actions, because as they saw it, these things assured the regular succession of the seasons, the coming of the rains, the springing of the plants upon which they lived, and the resurrection of the sun. The Mexican nation, and above all the priests and the dignitaries, was engaged day after day in a continually renewed white magic operation, a perpetual collective effort without which nature itself would be destroyed. It was therefore the gravest of life's occupations, the most imperative of duties. Nevertheless, this great preoccupation with religious ceremony did not prevent either the guilds or the people from following their ordinary callings. In their workshops, the craftsmen cast and chiseled the gold, and at the same time the posteca made ready for their further voyages, or sold the goods that they had brought back from the distant provinces. Commerce, in all its forms, spread through the markets and the streets. A host of minor trades provided those who worked at them with at least something to help towards their family's maintenance. Women sold those maize cakes called tamales to passers-by, as well as atoli, a maize porridge, cocoa ready for drinking, dishes seasoned with peppers and tomatoes, and cooked meat. But it was men who displayed maize, calabash seeds, oil seeds, honey, saucepans, and mats. No doubt they did all their best to attract clients by praising their wares and crying them with those traditional cries that gave a street its life. The hurried lawyer hastening to the court, like the official going to his office, or the countryman spending a day in town to sell his produce, would stop for a moment and eat a snack before going on. The timber carriers, painting as they trotted under their heavy load, would come down from the mountains, and some would go into relays so as not to fail under the weight of the beams and rafters. Elsewhere, a team of laborers called out by the local authority would be repairing an aqueduct under the orders of an official. The system of the taquit, or requisition collective labor, to which the plebeians were liable, provided for the execution of public works. In this manner, the authorities had very considerable quantities of labor at their disposal, and it was thus, for example, that the great dike called the Old Water Wall, Huehue Tenamit, was built in the time of Moctezuma I by workmen called up from all parts. By the same system, too, Indians from Texcoco, Azcapotzalco, Tlacopan, Coyoacan, Xochimilco, and 4 other towns cut the canal to bring the water from a spring to Mexico under the reign of Ahuitzotl. An anthill, one would have said, observes the chronicler. And indeed, it is exactly an anthill that one thinks of at the spectacle of the quiet, efficient, orderly work that fills all the industrious length of the day. Meals. The Mexican of former times was the same frugal being that he is today. Most of the time he was satisfied with a sparse and meager diet, primarily composed of maize in the shape of cakes, pottage, or tamales, and the beans and the huatli, or amaranth seeds, and chian, or sage. However, for all that, it is but justice to admit that the diet of a pre-Columbian plebeian was more varied than the diet of his equivalent today, for it included some plants, both cultivated like the huatli, and wild, and batrachians, and insects, of all which are much less used today, if not totally forgotten. The upper classes, of course, were able to enjoy a much more advanced kind of cookery. At dawn, the time of rising, there was no meal, no breakfast. This happened only at about 10 o'clock, after some hours of work, and it nearly always consisted of a bowl of atoli, a maize porridge, thick or thin as the case might be, and either sweetened with honey or seasoned with pimento. Rich men and dignitaries could drink cocoa, a luxury imported from the hotlands, sweetened with vanilla-scented honey or mixed with green maize, with oak leaf fermented agave sap, or with pimento. The main meal was in the middle of the day, for everybody, during the hottest hours, and those that could followed it with a short siesta. For the common people, it was but a brief affair: maize cakes, beans, pimento, or tomato sauce, and sometimes tamales. Rarely any meat, such as game, venison, or poultry, turkey. Water was their drink. A family, squatting round the hearth on their mats, would eat their frugal meal without spending long over it. The man of the house would often be obliged by his work to be away at noon, and he would eat his lunch, his itacat, from a bag prepared by his wife in the morning. But in rich men's houses, dinner was a matter of many and varied dishes. Every day more than 300 were prepared for Motecuzoma, and 1,000 for the inhabitants of the palace. Before eating, the emperor chose whatever pleased him among the day's dishes: turkeys, pheasants, partridges, crows, wild or tame ducks, deer, wild boars, pigeons, hares, rabbits. Then he sat down alone on an ikpali, and a low table was put in front of him, with a white tablecloth and white napkins. 4 very handsome, very clean women gave him water for his hands in the deep finger bowls that are called xicales, calabashes. Other plate-like vessels were held under his hands, and they gave him towels. Then 2 other women brought maize cakes. From time to time the sovereign was pleased to honor one of the dignitaries of his suite by giving him one of the dishes that he liked. When he had finished the first and chief course, they brought him fruit of all the kinds that grow in the country, but he only ate a very little fruit, and that at long intervals. After this, he drank cocoa and washed his hands as he had at the beginning of the meal. Dwarf or hunchback buffoons produced their tricks and their jokes. Motecuzoma took one of the painted, gilded pipes that had been placed within his reach, smoked for a short while, and went to sleep. In the emperor's palace at Mexico, and no doubt in the palaces of the allied kings and the great men in the provinces, enough food was made ready to supply the personal suite, the officials, the priests, etc. When the sovereign had eaten, he bade his pages or his servants, all the lords and ambassadors who had come from the various towns, and also the palace guards. They were also fed those who brought up the young men, who are called tepuxtlatoque, as well as the priests of the idols, and the singers, and the servants, and all those who belonged to the palace, and also the workmen, the goldsmiths, the feather workers, the lapidaries, and those who make mosaics, and those who make these splendid shoes for the dignitaries, and the hairdressers who cut their hair. They were also given cocoa prepared in various ways. Sahagún lists some 10 different recipes. The skill of the Aztec chefs was shown by a comparable variety in their dishes. The same historian gives 7 kinds of maize cake, 6 of tamales, many kinds of roast or seethed meat, some 20 made dishes of poultry, fish, batrachians or insects, and an infinite variety of vegetable, pulse, sweet potato, pimento, and tomato dishes. Among the dishes that the rulers particularly liked may be mentioned tamales stuffed with meat, snails, or fruit, the last being served with clear poultry soup, frogs with pimento sauce, white fish, istak michi, with red pepper and tomatoes, axolots, a kind of newt peculiar to Mexico and considered a great delicacy, with yellow peppers, fish served with a sauce made of crushed calabash seeds, other fish with a sharp fruit not unlike our cherries, wing dance, agave worms, meoquilin, maize and watli pottages, salted or sugared, with pimento or honey, French beans, echote, and various kinds of roots, including the camote, or sweet potato. As the ancient Mexicans had neither fat nor oil, they could not fry. Everything was either grilled or more often boiled and very highly peppered and seasoned. As they had no cattle either, the meat part of their diet came solely from game and the two domesticated creatures, the turkey and the dog. Central Mexico at that time was very rich in game. Rabbits, hares, deer, wild pigs, peccaries, birds such as pheasants, crows, doves, and above all, the innumerable species of wildfowl that filled the lakes. This wealth in the lakes and the marshes had been a happy compensation for the wretchedness of the Aztecs in the early days, and in the 16th century the people still drew a considerable share of their food from these birds, which, at given seasons, arrived in hosts to settle on the water and make their nests in the reeds and the rushes. Furthermore, and this was no doubt something that had persisted from the days when the tribe had barely managed to keep itself in the marshes, the Mexicans ate a wide variety of things that came from the water: frogs, axolots, tadpoles, tepocat, freshwater shrimps, acositlin, little waterflies, amoyot, aquatic larvae, ananetzli, white worms, oquilistak, and even the eggs that a waterfly, the ashayakat, laid in enormous quantities upon the water, and which were eaten as a sort of caviar under the name ahuagli. Poor people and the lakeside peasants skimmed a floating substance from the surface which was called tequitlat, stone dung. It was something like cheese, and they squeezed it into cakes. They also ate the spongy nests of waterfly larvae. Those things were the meat of poverty, which the tribe had been happy enough to find, no doubt, when it was lowly and poor, and by the 16th century they were no more than supplements in the diet of the homeless people. But even the rich and the lords themselves did not scorn batrachains, some reptiles, some of the iguana, guaquetzpali, and some ants, nor the agave worms, which are still thought of as a great delicacy in Mexico today. And then, since the empire had stretched to reach both the oceans, they had learned of the delights of sea fish, turtles, crabs, and oysters. The turkey, totoli, the male was called huecholot, from which comes the present guajalote, was a native of Mexico, and it had been domesticated there from the earliest times. The Spaniards often called it the chicken of the country. It was the chief inhabitant of the farmyard or poultry run, and each family had some in its garden next to the house. The poorer people ate turkey only on great occasions, however. As for the dog, it was a particular hairless kind which was fattened for eating. Its flesh was no doubt less esteemed than that of the turkey, for Sahagun tells us that in dishes the turkey meat was put on top, and the dog underneath, to make it seem more para hacer buto. However, a great many of these creatures were reared, and the chronicler Muñoz Camargo states that he had some of them himself well after the conquest. The custom died out because of the introduction of European cattle, and also, it appears, because the killing of the dogs was inextricably mixed with the certain pagan ceremonies, and it was opposed by the Spanish authorities. For the same kind of reason, the Spanish clergy and missionaries labored against the growing of the amaranth or watli. From the point of view of the material well-being of the Mexicans, they only had too much success. But in their eyes, this plant, which gave a considerable harvest, was too closely bound to the native religion. It is known, however, that the ancient Mexican thought of their four food plants as almost equally valuable. They were maize, centley, which was revered above all as the essential source of life, the bean, et, amaranth, and sage. The Codex Mendoza shows that the cities that were subjected to tribute were obliged to furnish the Aztec collectors with considerable quantities of these four commodities each year. The seeds of the last two could be made into tzoali and gianpinoli, refreshing and nourishing gruel, and an oil not unlike linseed oil was extracted from the seeds of sage and used for plant. The period between the two harvests, the time in June and July, when ends with barley meat, was a time of anxiety and extreme hunger for the Indians of those days, as it still is for those who live in the remote country or the infertile parts. Then men were hungry indeed. Then the grains of maize cost a great deal, and then was the time of great dearth. In Mexico, the government tried to remedy the situation by distributing victuals to the people during the month of Hue Dequihuit. The emperor showed his goodwill towards the common people by causing them all to be given tamales and maize porridge. Elsewhere, people were obliged to revert to gathering wild plants in the manner of those who lived before agriculture. The Aztecs may have reproached the Otomi with stooping so low as to eat unclean animals, such as snakes, rats, and lizards, but they themselves were obliged to seek the edible wild plants, the quilite, quelites in modern Hispano-Mexican, and they could distinguish the use and appearance of a wonderful variety of them. Sahagún describes a great many species, including the huaquilite, or wild amaranth, which was particularly valued. The peasant women sold them in markets. The mother of the emperor Itzcoatl himself had sold quilite in the marketplace of Azcapotzalco. In spite of its apparent abundance, nature was hard on men in Mexico. Famines often occurred. Every year there was the threat of shortage, and agricultural techniques were too primitive to be able to contend with uncommon emergencies such as swarms of locusts, sudden multitudes of rodents, excessive falls of rain or snow. One of the chief tasks of the native government was the accumulation of sufficient reserves in the granaries to cope with these disasters. In 1450, the three rulers of the allied cities distributed the saved up stores of grain of 10 years and more. But still, there was always the need for stopgap foods, animal or vegetable, in an emergency, and the primitive nomad, living by hunting and gathering, continually shows through the settled farmer. In the time of dearth, the peasants of the Central Plateau would slip back through many centuries. As we have seen, the Mexicans breakfasted in the middle of the morning and dined at the beginning of the afternoon. The second meal was also the last for most of them, unless they happened to take a gruel, thirst-quenching and nourishing at the same time, made of maize, amaranth, or sage, before going to bed. But those who stayed up, dignitaries or merchants giving a feast or a banquet, would sup abundantly and often all night long. Stores had to be procured in advance for one of these banquets: maize, beans, pulses, peppers, tomatoes, 80 or 100 turkeys, a score of dogs, 20 loads of cocoa. The guests came towards midnight. When they had all come, they were given water for washing their hands, and then the meal was served. Once this was done with, they washed their hands again and their mouths, and then cocoa and pipes were handed about. Lastly, the guests were given cloaks and flowers as presents. Here one is concerned with a gathering of rich merchants. The feasts went on until the dawn, with dances and songs, and the party broke up only in the morning, after a last cup of scented cocoa, redolent of honey and vanilla. Tobacco, as it has already been pointed out, had a great place. Guests, at least among the ruling class and the merchants, were given pipes ready for smoking at the end of the meal. These were cylindrical tubes with no separate bowl, and they were made of reed or perhaps sometimes of baked clay. They were highly decorated, and they were charged with a mixture of tobacco, charcoal, and liquid amber. One thus had a kind of large aromatic cigar, and its taste must have been rather unlike that which is expected in a cigar today. There was not very much smoking between meals. Strolling about with a pipe in one's hand was a mark of nobility and elegance. Tobacco was widely used in medicine and in religious ceremonies. It was thought to have pharmaceutical virtues and a religious value, and in some ceremonies the priests carried a calabash filled with tobacco on their back. The use of the plant among the laity in the pre-Cortesian period does not seem to have spread to the common people. Other far more efficacious narcotics or intoxicants were also in use, and the users of them sought either consolation or prophetic visions. The authors particularly mention the peyote, a little cactus which is a native of northern Mexico and which brings about colored hallucinations. Those who eat it, says Sahagún, have horrifying or comic visions, and this drunkenness lasts 2 or 3 days before it going off. This plant is used as a food by the Chichimecs. It sustains them and gives them courage to fear neither battle nor thirst nor hunger, and they say that it preserves them from all danger. Peyote still plays a great part in the religious life of the Indians of the northwest of Mexico and the south of the U.S. Other plants, whose effects have not yet been studied, appear to have been used as narcotics. Among them were the vegetative parts of the tlapat, one of the solanaceae, and the seeds of the mishit. But the one most often referred to in literature was a fungus, the deonanacat, sacred fungus, which was to be served to the guests at the beginning of a banquet. The first thing that was eaten at this feast was a little black fungus which makes men drunk and gives them visions. It also inclines them to lechery. They ate it before sunrise, with honey, and when they began to grow warm, they started to dance. Some sang, some wept, so drunk were they by the reason of these funguses. And others did not sing, but sat quiet in the room, thinking. Some saw that they were going to die, and wept. Some saw themselves devoured by a wild beast. Some saw themselves taken prisoners upon a battlefield, or else growing rich, or the masters of many slaves. Others saw that they would be convicted of adultery, and that by reason of this crime their heads would be crushed. Others saw that they would steal and be killed, and there were many other visions. When the drunkenness caused by these funguses had died away, they talked to one another about the visions that they had. Perhaps the most surprising point for us in all these descriptions is that there never is at any time any question of alcoholic drinks. Yet the Indians were perfectly well acquainted with an alcoholic drink, ocli, now called pulque, which is obtained by fermenting the sap of the agave and which is quite like cider. The importance of ocli is provided by the very important role played in religion by the gods of drink and drunkenness, those who were called the Senton Totochtin, the 400 innumerable rabbits, the lunar and terrestrial gods of plenty and of the harvest, as well as Mayawel, the goddess of the agave. But the ancient Mexicans were perfectly well aware of the danger for them and for their civilization that alcoholic intoxication implied. Perhaps no culture in history has ever set up more rigid barriers against this danger. That drink, which is called ocli, said the emperor in his address to the people after his election, is the root and the origin of all evil and of all perdition. For ocli and drunkenness are the cause of all the discords and of all the dissensions, of all the revolt and of all troubles in cities and in realms. It is like the whirlwind that destroys and tears down everything. It is like a malignant storm that brings all evil with it. Before adultery, rape, debauching of girls, incest, theft, crime, cursing, and bearing false witness, murmuring, calumny, riots, and brawling, there is always drunkenness. All those things are caused by ocli and by drunkenness. When one studies the literature upon the subject, one has the feeling that the Indians were very clearly aware of their strong natural inclination to alcoholism, and that they were quite determined to work against this evil and to control themselves by practicing an extraordinarily severe policy of repression. Nobody drank wine ocli excepting those who were already aged, and they drank a little in secret without becoming drunk. If a drunk man showed himself in public, or if he were caught drinking, or if he were found speechless in the street, or if he wandered about singing or in the company of other drunkards, he was punished, if he were a plebeian, by being beaten to death, or else he was strangled before the young men of the district, by way of an example and to make them shun drunkenness. If a drunkard were noble, he was strangled in private. There were ferocious laws against public drunkenness. The statutes of Nezahualcóyotl punished the priest taken in drunkenness with death, and death was the punishment for the drunken dignitary. official, or ambassador if he were found in the palace. The dignitary who had got drunk without scandal was still punished, but only by the loss of his office and his titles. The drunken plebeian got off the first time with having no more than his head shaved in public, while the crowd jeered at him, but the backslider was punished with death, as the nobles were for their first offense. Here we have an exceedingly violent case of socially defensive reaction against an equally violent tendency, whose existence has been historically proved, for when the conquest had destroyed the moral and judicial underpinning of Mexican civilization, alcoholism spread among the Indians to an extraordinary degree. However, even so severe a system as this had to have some kind of safety valve. Alcohol was not entirely prohibited. Old men and women were allowed to drink, particularly on certain holidays, and it was even considered that they might get drunk. For example, when the baptism, or rather name-giving of a child, was celebrated, at night the old men and the old women gathered to drink pulque and to get drunk. In order that they should get drunk, a large jar of pulque was put before them, and the person who served it poured the drink into the calabashes and gave each one a drink in turn. And the server, when he saw that the guests were not yet drunk, began serving them again in the reverse order, beginning at the left side by the lower end. Once they were drunk, they would sing. Some did not sing, but held forth, laughing and making jokes, and when they heard anything funny, they would roar with laughter. All this was as though the Mexicans, wishing to cut their losses, allowed the pleasures of drink only to those whose active life was over, while at the same time they set up a barrier of terrible punishments against indulgence by young people or middle-aged men. Games and amusements. We have already touched upon the realm of games and amusement in speaking of banquets. No doubt these great feasts always had some relation to a religious festival or to a religious ceremony. But, like our wedding breakfast or Christmas Eve parties, they were also occasions for being merry with one's friends and relations. Those who had the means, and foremost among them the emperor, loved, as they ate or smoked, taking their cocoa at the end of the meal, to hear poems recited or sung to the accompaniment of flutes, drums, and two-toned gongs, or teponazli. The guests themselves danced to the sound of these instruments after the feast. One of the most valued delights was that of hunting. The common people may have hunted for the pot or to sell their game, but the nobles hunted for the pleasure of it. In their gardens and their parks, and in the game-filled countryside, they went after birds with their blowpipes. Moctezuma, wishing to amuse himself, went with 25 of the most important Mexicans to a place which he had at Adlacuhuayan, which is now called Tacubaya. He went into the garden alone to divert himself with killing birds in a blowpipe. This is the blowpipe that shoots bait clay balls, and it had been known for a very long time throughout Mexico and Central America. It is the blowpipe of the Quiche demigods in the Popol Vuh, and the same as that which is shown in the reliefs on a vase from Teotihuacan. There were also great barrios, which took place particularly in the 14th month of the year Quecholi, which was sacred to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, and to the god of hunting Mixcoatl. On the 10th day of this month, all the warriors of Mexico and Tlatelolco met on the wooden slopes of the Zacatepet, and spent the night there in huts they had made from branches. At dawn the next day, they ranged themselves in a long line, like a single length of rope, and they drove the deer, coyotes, rabbits, and hares forward before leaping in to attack the surrounded creatures. Those who killed a deer or a coyote were given a present by the emperor, who also provided food and drink for everybody. In the evening, hunters returned to the city, carrying as trophies the heads of the animals that had been killed. The Mexicans were passionately addicted to gambling, and there were two games that fascinated them to such a pitch that some Indians finished by losing all their belongings and even their liberty, for they would come to the point of selling themselves as slaves. These were Tlaxli and Patoli. Lastly, the ball game had been played in Mexico from the remotest antiquity. Courts have been found in cities dating from the height of the Mayan civilization. El Tayin and at Tula, the one at Chichen Itza in Yucatan, is among the most splendid monuments in all of Central America. Courts are often represented in the native manuscripts, and their plan is shown as a double T. Two sides faced one another, one on each side of a central line, and the game consisted of causing a heavy rubber ball to pass into the other part of the court. In the side walls, there were two carved stone rings, and if one of the sides managed to throw the ball through either of them, that side won the game out of hand. This was an uncommon and a difficult feat, however, and it was made all the more so by the fact that the players were not allowed to touch the ball with either their hands or their feet, but only with their knees and with their hips. The players threw themselves to the ground to get at the ball, and they received the full impact of it on their bodies when it was in flight. So, like modern rugby or baseball players, they were padded and provided with kneecaps and leather aprons, and even with chin pieces and half masks protecting their cheeks. They also wore leather gloves to protect their hands from the continual scraping on the ground. But in spite of all these precautious accidents were not uncommon. Some players, hit in the stomach or the belly, fell never to rise again. And after the game, most of them had to have incisions made in their buttocks to let out the extravasated blood. For all that, the game was played with a very great enthusiasm. Only the ruling class was allowed to play. Lastly, it certainly had a mythological and religious significance. It was thought that the court represented the world and the ball a heavenly body, the sun or the moon. The sky was a sacred lashli in which divine beings played with the stars as their ball. But in the everyday life of the laity, the game was the pretext for huge bets in which great quantities of clothes, feathers, gold, and slaves changed hands. It was essentially a game for great men, and for some of them it ended in ruin and slavery. Ixtlilxochitl tells how the Emperor Axayacat played against the Lord of Xochimilco and laid the marketplace of Mexico against a garden belonging to this lord. He lost. The next day, Mexican soldiers appeared at the palace of the fortunate winner, and while they saluted him and made him presents, they threw a garland of flowers about his neck with a thong hidden in it, and so killed him. Batoli was a game with dice, not unlike our game of Ludo. The Codex Magliabeciano shows 4 players sitting on the ground or on mats round a table shaped like a cross and divided into squares. At one side, there is a god, Maquilxochitl, utilitarian deity of dancing, music, and gambling, watching over them. For dice, the players use beans marked with a certain number of pips, and according to the figures obtained at each throw, they moved small colored stones from square to square on the board. The winner of the game and the stakes was the one who first came back to the square he had started from. Batoli, like Blashley, had a hidden inner meaning. There were 52 squares on the board. That is the same number of years that are contained by the combined divinatory and solar cycles. Batoli is still played, or at least it was still played 20 years ago, among the Nahua and Totonac Indians of the Sierra de Puebla. Unlike the aristocratic ball game, it was the most generally played game in all classes, and in it the Indians' passion for gambling could run unchecked. It is a curious fact that the Aztecs, although they were so puritanical about drinking and although their sex life was so restrained, never seem to have tried to curb gambling. The divinatory books go no further than warning those who were born under certain signs as Se Cali, for example, one house, that they would be great gamblers, and that in gambling they would lose all their possessions. The rhythm of day and night. The Mexicans, having neither clocks nor clepsydras, nor sundials either, could not divide their ways with any precision. However, A life of intense social and ritual activity presupposes the existence of certain fixed points, those which Munoz Camargo calls the hours and moments fixed for the government of the Republic. If we are to accept what this chronicler says, the trumpets and conches were sounded from the top of the temples of Tlaxcala 6 times every 24 hours, to wit, at the rising of Venus, in the middle of the morning, at noon, in the middle of the afternoon, at the beginning of the night, and at midnight. Still, expressions such as the middle of the morning or the middle of the afternoon are, in the absence of a time-measuring machine, necessarily uncertain. Yet it is true that the priests knew how to make observations of the heavenly bodies, of the sun's course, and of the movement of certain stars. They were therefore able to fix the intermediary points between east and the zenith, and between the zenith and the west, with a reasonable degree of accuracy. At night, they watched Venus and the Pleiades. According to Sahagun, the temple drums and conches marked 9 divisions in the 24 hours, 4 during the day, at sunrise, the middle of the morning, noon, and sunset, and 5 during the night, the beginning of night, the end of the twilight, the hour for going to bed, the hour when the priests were to get up to pray, a little after midnight, and a little before dawn. Some of these divisions were therefore quite long, the equivalent of 3 or 4 hours, and others were very short. The notion of an abstract time, susceptible of division and calculation, never seems to have arisen, but the days and nights had their rhythm, and this rhythm originated from the temple tops, the towers of the gods, and of the ritual that dominated the countryside and regulated human existence. By day, above the noise of a moving city, or in the silence of the night, there would come the sudden harsh cry of the conches and the melancholy roll of drums to mark the stages of the sun or the stars, and at each of these stages the priests offered up incense to the sun or to the lords of the shadows. It is very likely that these fixed points were used to determine the time for meetings, to call councils, and to open or close judicial hearings. The temple instruments ordered the day as the church bells might be in a Christian community. One might have supposed that a civilization that was almost without artificial light must have found its activities cut short by the fall of night, but this was not so. There were the priests who got up several times in the night to pray and chant, the youths from the local schools who were sent to bathe in the icy water of the lake or the springs, the lords and the merchants who feasted, the furtive traders who glided over the lake with their canoes loaded with wealth, sorcerers going to their sinister assignations, a nightlife that animated the darkened city, and the night, too, was pierced here and there by the glowing hearths of the temples and the glare of the resinous torches. The dark hours of the dreaded yet alluring night offered their cover for the most sacred rites, the most important visits, the loves of the warriors and the courtesans. Often the emperor would rise to offer his blood in the darkness and to pray. A watcher, with preternaturally acute senses, gazing over the whole valley from the top of one of the volcanoes, might have seen here and there the flickering of the flames, and have heard the music at the banquets, the beat of the dancing, the voices of the singers, and then, at intervals, the roll of the deponatli, and the scream of the dark vault of the sky without its human observer, the anxious watch for a tomorrow that might never come. Then the dawn came, and above the rumbling of the waking, towards the triumphant cry of the sacred trumpets, rose toward the sun the turquoise prince, the soaring eagle. A new day was beginning. This concludes Chapter 4.